Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sci C14. I hope you've enjoyed the 2 week break with Reading Week and then Canada Day week. And we're into the home stretch here, so we have only a few lectures remaining. And today we're going to talk about culture and emotion. So first, let's sort of remind ourselves where we've been over the first part of the course. So we started thinking about culture as a set of beliefs, attitudes, and practices, as well as institutions that emerge in order to address challenges posed by the environment in which groups of people live. Right. So culture is really these solutions to problems that groups have experienced in the environment they're inhabiting. And we've seen some evidence that the ability to transmit information across generations helps to refine and eliminate inefficiencies in emerging cultural practices. And then once these abilities, the ability to learn from others started to take hold, evolution began to select for psychological capacities that made social learning and the transmission of information more efficient and effective. Okay, and so what resulted was that Homo sapiens ended up with a set of psychological systems that are incredibly flexible at birth, that allow us to take on the cultural practices that we're born into. But as soon as we're born, we begin to selectively attend to information provided by the in-group, right? And that's because we can't maintain the amount of plasticity that we're born with due to sort of the costs of that amount of plasticity. And so what we've been doing in the last couple of lectures is we've started to see that these once we start to hone in on specific features of our in-group, that starts to influence how we think about ourselves, and it also impacts how we think about the world, right? In terms of thinking about ourselves, we talked about more independent or interdependent construals. And in terms of cognition, we talked about sort of more holistic and more analytic thinking. Okay, and so today we're going to go into the next domain and thinking about how culture might influence emotions, the emotions we experience, and how we display our emotions. Okay, so first I just want you to take a look at this face, all right, and think about what emotion you think is being expressed here. Okay, so just take a second and think about what emotion you think this person's feeling. Okay, so if you're like me, when I see this this photo, I'm thinking that this person's experiencing sadness, grief, something like that, right? However, when we add context to this picture, right, we realize that he's not actually experiencing sadness, right? He's just won a gold medal, right? He's experiencing something like pride, joy, maybe relief, right? And so what we see, there's two important things to take away here, okay? And the first is that when we looked at this first picture, right, you probably had a pretty intuitive response about what emotion was being experienced, right? And so we seem to be sort of tapping into this universal decoding, right, of what emotion is being experienced here. And similarly, right, when the context changed, you probably felt an immediate reappraisal of what the emotion was being experienced, right? It moved from thinking of sadness, and when you take into account context, you move to something like joy or pride, right? And this suggests that first, there seems to be some universal process at play, right? Either when we were just looking at the face or the face in the context, you had a pretty strong inclination or a strong reaction to what emotion was being experienced, right? But we move from two different emotional experiences, right? At first thinking that the individual was sad to thinking about the individual as experiencing joy. And that suggests that even though we have this sort of universal reaction, right, to decode the emotion that's being experienced, context plays a huge role, right, in determining what emotion we think people are experiencing. And because context plays a huge role, right, we can think of culture as being a context. And so if culture is a context, then culture is going to impact how we decode people's emotional expressions and their emotional experience. And so we can think about theories of emotion as being sort of set along this continuum, okay? And on the far left, we have these more functional or physiological theories of emotions, right? And here, at the core of these theories is the idea that emotions are the result of biology, right? There's very little role for culture, right? What determines the emotions we experience is really just a function of our biological, our evolutionary heritage, okay? And on the other hand, we have more social construction theories of emotion. And here, really, emotions are completely contextual, right? And there's a very minimal role for biology, right? So the emotions we experience are really just a function of cultural learning, okay? And in the middle, we have these more appraisal or two-factor theories of emotion, right? And these theories posit that emotions are really the result of a complex interaction of biology and culture, right? Emotions do have some universal physiological component across all humans, but the specific emotions that we experience, right, the labels we might put on our emotional experience are going to differ across contexts, okay? So let's take a look at these theories in a little bit more detail. We're really not going to talk much about social construction theories of emotion. They kind of lie right on the fringes of what might be considered psychology, but we are really interested in these functional and two appraisal theories of emotion. So when we think about the functional or evolutionary approach to emotion, is really this line of thinking really begins with Charles Darwin. And his idea was that emotions provide a repertoire of adaptive behaviors that facilitate human survival, okay? And so the idea here is that we've developed the capacity for emotion because it helps us behave in ways, right, that are going to help us survive, okay? And so we might think about, an early human moving across the grasslands of Africa and experiencing fear, right? Because there's potential predators lurking in that grass, right? And that experience of fear makes them avoid that specific area, right? Making them more likely to avoid predation, right? So this fear in this case provides this functional advantage, right? That allows the species to survive, okay? And so the James Lang theory of emotion really sort of comes out of Darwin's view. And the idea here is that our bodies respond to stimuli in the world by preparing us to react in a survival facilitating manner, right? So the idea is that emotions are these reactions that prepare our body, right, to act in a way that's going to help us survive. And so emotions are these bodily changes that signal how we should behave, right? So we have these physiological responses and that are products of autonomic nervous system changes, right? Heart rate, breathing, pupil dilation, blood flow, etc. Right? And William James has this nice quote where he says, "What would joy, rage, love be without the heart palpitations and muscle tension?" Right? And his idea here is that what constitute an emotion are these physiological changes, right? Heart palpitations and muscle tension are necessary components of what we consider to be an emotion, okay? And so there's some evidence, there's a significant amount of evidence to support this view. We're going to talk about one study by Susskind and colleagues here. And so they're really interested in how different emotions might impact how we sort of control our face and the types of sensory sensations that we allow to enter our brain, right? They start with this idea of why are specific muscle actions in the face associated with different emotional states. Okay. And so they go on to suggest that facial expressions first serve some kind of functional role, right? They help an organism respond effectively to the environment. And that once we had this adaptive sort of facial reaction to a given stimuli, it took on communicative value, right, later, right? People could see someone making a facial expression and they knew what emotion they were experiencing, and now they could start to guide their own behavior. Okay, and so if this is true, right, facial expressions for a given emotion should provide some adaptive advantage. Okay, and so Susskind and colleagues were really trying to see if they could provide some evidence that the facial reactions we make for certain emotions actually do provide an adaptive advantage. And so the two emotions that they were interested in looking at in this study were disgust and fear. Okay, and so we might think, well, what is the adaptive advantage of disgust? Right. So when we're disgusted by something, we're really being exposed to something that's likely a poison or contains pathogens or diseases. Right. When we think about seeing a gross picture or something like that, right? We're really sort of tapping into this idea of like, oh, there's something dirty or potentially harmful in that object that we're looking at, the disgusting object, right? And so if we're looking at something disgusting, right, that could possibly harm us, right, it could give us a disease or poison us, we should want to close down our senses as much as possible, right? We want to close any of the mucous membranes that we have, right, in order to prevent pathogens or poisons or diseases from entering the system, right? And so we can see in the disgust face here, right, this is a disgust emotional response, we can see everything kind of closing up, right? The eyes are closing here, the nostrils are kind of closing, the mouth is closing, right? Everything's kind of closing down, right? Now, this is different when we're thinking about a fear response, right? A fear is a response to threat, right? And that should lead to a heightened need for sensation, right? We want to be able to take in as much information about the environment as possible in order to avoid whatever is potentially causing that fear, right? And so this should really result in an opening of the senses, right? We want to open our eyes here, right? Here's a fear response here. We want to open our eyes to be able to scan the environment effectively, right? We want to open our nostrils, right? Take in any smells that might be indicative of something fearful, right? And so the idea here is that, we want to open the senses to detect information in the environment, but also prepare our body for what reaction might come, right? If we open our nostrils, we're going to take more oxygen into the body, right? We're going to be preparing our muscles for fight or flight, okay? And so they chose these two emotions to look at because they really provide a nice juxtaposition for what we would expect from a functional facial reaction, right? If we're being exposed to a disgusting stimuli, or we're going to close down our facial structures, our eyes, our nose, our mouths. And for fear, we really want to do the opposite. We want to open up those sense organs, right? The eyes, nose, and mouth. Okay. So here are the results from this study for the eye. So all they did in this study was just showed individuals fear-inducing or disgusting photos. Okay, that's all I did. And there's a well-used set of photos called the IAPS images. They're International Effective Photograph Series, I believe is what the acronym stands for. And so all they did was they showed them these photos, and they were taking into account how wide, and these results are how wide or closed their eyes became. Okay, so we're really looking at the amount of how open or closed their eyes were. Okay, and so if we look at the results here, the solid line here is a neutral expression, right? So this is how open the individual's eyes were when they were neutral, and we can see here fear is this black line here, and we can see that when experiencing fearful photos, right, their eyes are opening much larger, right? And disgust here is the broken line, right? And we can see that when being exposed to disgusting photos, their eyes close, right? Close significantly from the neutral position. And the graph here is just the summation of this, right? So overall, the individual eyes were more open for fearful stimuli and more closed, right, for disgust stimuli, right? So this provides evidence that we do see this differential pattern of whether how open or closed the eye is based on the emotional stimuli being presented. And the eye is either opening or closing relative to the emotion that we would think is important, right? For disgust, we want to close down the eye, prevent pathogens from potentially getting into the body. For fear, we want to open the eyes up, right? Taking as much information about the environment as we can. Well, they also looked at the nose, right? So they could look at how open or closed the nasal passages were, okay? And so here we can see, this is the neutral position, right, of the nostril. We can see how this darker region is how open the passage is. And we can see on the left-hand side is disgust, right? So you can see, right, comparing these two photos, that when experiencing disgust, right, the nasal passages is closing down, okay? And we can see this graphically represented here, right? This is the volume of the nasal passage that's open. We can see it's much smaller, right? Smaller volumes. The x-axis here is just the slice, right? So the where they were actually taking this MRI from. Okay, so here we can see the volumes really closed down for disgust, but for fear, right? This is the picture over here. And again, if we compare these two, we can see for fear, right, the nasal passage is opening up, right? Much more open, allowing oxygen to the body, perhaps smells that might be indicative of danger in the environment, right? And here we can see just the amount of volume increase, right, at the different point in the nose, right? And here's the summation of that graph, and we can see for fear, the nose is much more open, and in disgust, it's significantly closed, right? So again, we see this functional reaction for disgust in terms of nasal constriction, right? For disgust, we want to close it down, prevent pathogens or diseases from entering the body. But for fear, we want to open it up, right? We want to prepare the body for fight or flight, open those nasal passages to get as much oxygen to the body as possible, right? Or potentially allow for increased sense of smell, which might provide us with information about what fearful or what fear-inducing stimuli is in the environment to be avoided, okay? And so if we want to just sort of summarize the sort of James Lange theory of emotion here, the idea here is that, we see this sort of fear-inducing stimuli, right? And we have this physiological response, right? So we see the bear, our heart starts pounding, we're trembling, we're sweating, and we run away, right? And these physiological responses are fear, right? It's this unique physiological response, right, that tells us that we're experiencing fear, right? And so it suggests that emotions we experience have been selected for by natural selection, and it also has the implication that if the emotions we're experiencing are selected via natural selection, that these emotional experiences should be universal and experienced across cultures, right? And so across cultures, we should see that this pattern of physiological response is interpreted as fear, okay? And that's the big assumption that we're going to dig into a little more as the lecture goes on. Now, the James Lange theory of emotion was not uncontroversial. In fact, it's very controversial to this day. And Cannon and Baird really were the first individuals to critique this work. And they suggested that our autonomic nervous system is too slow and underspecified to account for the range of emotions we experience, right? And so when we think about this, right, we think about, the range of emotions we're capable of, right, and the different degrees of emotions we're capable of. Our autonomic nervous system only has so many constellations of physiological response that it can engage in, right? It can increase our heart rate or decrease our heart rate. It can increase respiration, decrease respiration, right? There's only a few things that it can really do. And so there's not enough sort of variability in the patterns that the physiological or the autonomic system can engage in to account for the range of experience, right? And furthermore, we do have hormone mediated systems that help us to produce emotions, but these are too slow, right? We feel emotions almost instantaneously, right? We see a stimuli, we have an emotional response almost instantaneously. But these hormone mediated systems take time, right? And they can't account for this sort of instantaneous emotional response that we experience when we sort of see an emotionally inducing stimulus in the environment, okay? And so based on this critique, these sort of two-factor or appraisal theories of emotion started to emerge. And the idea here is that the emotion experience is a function of how one appraises bodily reactions to a stimulus, okay? And so the idea here is that bodily reactions, physiological response, is indeed a component of the emotions we experience, but it's actually the appraisal of that physiological response, right? How we think about, oh, my heart's beating faster. What does that mean, right? We make an appraisal of that change in our physiology, and that ultimately tells us what emotion we're experiencing, okay? So we can think about this idea sort of through this summation here. So we see the grizzly bear, right? And we experience all the same physiological responses that we had in the James Lange theory, but we have to add this label, right? That's one scary bear. I'm afraid of it, right? It's the combination of heart pounding, trembling, sweating, running away, right? That combined with this label, right, that we put on it, that's fear. And to think about this, we might want to think about, well, are there any situations where we might experience the same physiological response, but be experiencing a different emotion, right? Perhaps like surprise, right? Or something like that, right? Where we're surprised and our heart starts to pound and we start to tremble and we start to sweat, right? But we're experiencing a different emotion, right? And so the idea of these appraisal or two-factor theories is not enough to know what the physiological response is in order to be able to tell what emotion a person's experienced. We have to know something about the physiological response, but we also have to know how they're labeling that response, right? In order to determine what emotion they're experiencing. Okay. So emotions result from our conscious or unconscious cognitive evaluations of situations of our internal state, right? And these cognitive evaluations are going to be heavily influenced by culture, right? How we interpret our physiological response is going to be influenced by the culture we're raised in. And therefore, appraisal theories of emotion suggest that culture will influence our emotional experience, okay? And so just to get an idea of this sort of misattribution of emotion, we can think about a classic study by Dutton and Aaron in 1974. And what they were interested in is they had people, what they were interested in is how people are going to interpret sort of their physiological arousal, okay? And so they had male participants, and they were approached by an attractive female research assistant and asked to complete a questionnaire, okay? And once they had completed the experiment, the participants were told that if they wanted more information, that they could call this number and she'd be happy to talk about the experiment with them, okay? And what they did, though, is they manipulated sort of the arousal that the individuals were going to be experiencing during that interaction, okay? So half the participants were approached while they were on the Capilano suspension bridge, and this bridge is a picture of the bridge here, right? It's quite narrow, it's pretty wobbly, it's over this sort of canyon with a river below, right? It's kind of a scary thing, right? And so individuals that were approached on the Capilano Bridge should be experiencing this sort of arousal, right? Just from being on the bridge, right? It's a sort of arousal-inducing experience. And the idea here is that would they, attribute that arousal to the bridge, like being on the bridge itself, or were they going to sort of misattribute this arousal to interacting with this attractive female research assistant? And in the low arousal condition, they used another bridge that was just a little further down the river, but this one was very sturdy. It wasn't too high off the ground, right? So it should be a low arousal situation, okay? And so the idea here is that participants on the Capilano Bridge should have been experiencing increased arousal. But if the physiological theory of emotion is true, right, the James Lange version, this increased arousal should immediately be linked to the emotion fear, right? Because we're experiencing the stimuli, we're having this emotional response, right? Fear is what we're experiencing. However, if the appraisal theory of emotion is true, right, then the individual is going to be experiencing this more undifferentiated arousal, right? And it could be misattributed, right, to either, it could be attributed to either the being on the scary bridge, or it might be attributed to an emotional reaction caused by the attractive research assistant. Okay, and so what they thought is that if these male participants were misattributing their arousal to being produced by the female research assistant, that they'd be more likely to call the number that she gave them in order to find out more about the study. Okay. And as we can see, right, on the control bridge, right, the more sturdy bridge, right, where it should have been low arousal, only 2 of 16 of the participants called, 12.5%. But on the Capilano Bridge, 9 out of 18, 50% of the individuals that participated followed up with the researcher to speak with her again, right? And so the idea here is that these individuals must have been misattributing sort of their emotional state, not to its actual cause, which was just being on this scary bridge, but to interacting with this attractive researcher. And so the idea here is that to understand, the emotional experience of an individual, it's not enough to know their physiological response, right? We have to know something about how they're appraising the situation that they're in, right? Whether they're, in this case, thinking that, this physiological arousal is a result of being on the bridge, or if they're thinking, this physiological arousal is the result of me interacting with this attractive researcher, okay? And so this idea that these different appraisals of our emotional response opens the door to this idea that culture is going to affect these appraisals, and therefore individuals' emotional responses to different stimuli are going to be different. We're going to detect these cultural differences in emotional responses to different stimuli. Okay. Now, if anybody is interested in emotional research and the most current thinking on emotion, this is a very hot topic area. There's still lots of disagreement about what emotions are, where they come from, what they do. But Lisa Feldman Barrett is one of the top scholars studying emotion right now, and she's written this fantastic book, How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. And I highly recommend anybody that's interested in this topic picking this book up and giving it a thorough read. So when we start to think about, we've basically kind of gone through a bit of a primer about, where emotions, theories of emotion, right, and where they come from. And we see this sort of tension between these sort of more functional theories that sort of suggest that emotional experience is going to be universal, right? We've evolved these physiological responses that guide our behavior, right, and are mediated by this experience that we call emotion. And so there we should see some universality of emotions across cultures. But the tension, this is in tension with this sort of more appraisal view, which is that physiological arousal isn't enough, right? We're going to need to know something about how people are appraising that arousal in order to understand what emotions they're experiencing. And that opens the door for there being culturally unique appraisals of that arousal. And therefore we should see sort of cultural differences in emotional experience. And so we're going to talk about these two different themes in the remainder of the lecture. Okay, so when we're starting to think about the tension between the idea that emotions are universal, right, that they're going to be experienced across cultures, we might want to start to think about how emotions are displayed on the face. And Paul Ekman was the first individual to look into this idea in depth and developed what he calls the neurocultural theory of emotion. And here the idea is that emotions evolved as a rapid and coordinated response system to quickly and efficiently respond to events that affect their welfare. And facial expressions are part of this response system, right? So much like the evolutionary model that we talked about before of Darwin and James Lang. And therefore, we should see emotions expressed in the same way across cultures, okay? And so the idea here is that in terms of if emotions have evolved because they provide this functional adaptation, right, that we should see this sort of universal expression of emotions across cultures, right? A happy expression should be recognized by all individuals all over the world, regardless of their culture, okay? And Ekman suggested that culture may modify the intensity of these emotional expressions, but they would still be recognizable to individuals from any culture. And so Ekman in 1969 did a study looking at participants from the United States, Japan, Argentina, Chile, and showed them photos of individuals making different emotional expressions. And they found that there was a lot of agreement, right, between people from these different countries. I made similar judgments about what facial expressions were being made. So if we look at, these are some examples of the Ekman photos that depict the 6 fundamental emotions. So we have anger, disgust, fear, surprise, sadness, and happiness. Okay. But the problem with this original research from 1969 was that the cultures that they utilized had all had a significant exposure to Western media, right? And therefore, there is the chance that this broad recognition of these different emotional expressions isn't because they're evolved and therefore universal, but because people had learned what these emotional expressions meant through their exposure to media. And so in 1971, Ekman visited the Fore tribe in New Guinea, and this tribe at the time had very little exposure, in fact, very, very little exposure to any kind of Western influence. And therefore, if they were able to recognize these emotional expressions, then it would be really strong evidence that the types of expressions that we make to express these different emotions are indeed universal across cultures. And so they had 189 adults and 130 children, and that represented about 3% of the total Fore population. And these individuals had no contact with Western missionaries or government workers, and they had no exposure with Western media. They didn't speak or understand any English words or phrases. And so participants were told a story that depicted a situation where an individual would experience one of 6 of the basic emotions, right? And so here's a story that might represent happiness, right? Her friends have come and she is happy, okay? And so they'd be told this story, and they would say, what emotion, is this person experiencing, right? And so, they should be experiencing happiness. For disgust, she is looking at something that smells bad. What emotion would she be experiencing? All right, if they get it right, they would say that they would be experiencing this disgust emotion, okay? And so participants were shown 2 or 3 pictures and asked which expression that person would make, okay?
So what we're looking at here is the results of the study from 1971. And table 1 here are the results for the adults, and table 2 is the results for children. Okay, and so here we have the emotion that was described in the story. Right, so this first one here described an event where the person should feel happiness, and the distractor emotions that were shown were surprise and disgust. Right, so the individual was told a story that was happy, and they were shown a happiness face, a surprise face, and a disgust face, and asked to identify what emotion the individual will be experiencing, right? So they should pick the happy face. And that's what we see, right? 90% of people, right, of the 4 individuals correctly identified the happy expression, right, when thinking about a happy story. And when we look down this column, right, of the percentage choosing the correct face, we see these really, really high percentages, right? We start to get a little bit lower around here, but there's basically widespread agreement, right, across these individuals that have had no Western exposure about what facial expressions correspond to these different emotional stories, okay? And we see the same pattern with children. For children, the paradigm was simplified, so they only had to pick between 2 faces. But again, we see, really strong, really large percentages of getting these correct, right? And so this is providing evidence that even these individuals that have had no Western contact, they are identifying the same facial configurations, facial expressions as Americans or from other cultures when thinking about what emotion people are going to be experiencing during a given situation. So the conclusions were really that both the 4 adults and children displayed a pattern of responding that's consistent with the idea of universal basic emotions, right? The idea is that if we've evolved this, if emotions are these evolved set of responses that are adaptive, right, and facial expressions are part of that response, then individuals across cultures should be able to identify what emotional expression is going to be made in a given circumstance, okay? Now, there was some emotions that were more difficult to distinguish from others, right? Fear and surprise seemed to be somewhat difficult for the 4 adults. And it suggests that that expression and recognition of basic emotions is not the result of culture-specific learning, but it's the result of natural selection, right? These individuals that had no Western contact were making the same judgments as Western individuals about what emotional expressions will be made in a given context. Now, this result from Ekman and colleagues wasn't accepted universally, although it has gained more and more support as time's gone on. But Matsumoto and Willingham wanted to see if they could provide some evidence or an even stronger test of this idea of universal sort of emotional expressions. And so researchers continue to argue that despite evidence that a small number of specific facial expressions are produced when emotions are elicited, there's still debate about the origin of these expressions, right? So it could be the result of culture constant learning, right? Individuals around the world learn through observation and modeling and reinforcement to associate facial configurations with certain emotional states or events, right? And those just happen to overlap a lot across cultures. Or we could get these very strong sort of universal expression, the idea being that expressions originate from an evolved response system. Facial configurations are genetically encoded in all humans and are a part of a larger response system, cognitive and physiological. Okay, and so there is this line of argument that suggests that even though Ekman found this high level of agreement in the 4 tribe for identifying facial reactions, there still might be these emotions still might be the result of cultural learning and not evolution. So Matsumoto and Willingham wanted to address this, and they needed a design that would be able to rule out this effect of learning and modeling of an emotional expression. And so what they did is they looked at congenitally blind individuals These are individuals that are born at birth, and therefore they have no opportunity to learn emotional expressions via modeling, right? They've never actually seen someone make an emotional expression, okay? And therefore, if these blind individuals make emotional expressions similar to sighted individuals, this would be very strong evidence, ruling out this cultural constant learning hypothesis that indeed emotions and emotional expressions are the product of evolution and are ingrained genetically. So what they did is they looked at 84 athletes from 35 different countries that were competing in the 2004 Olympic and Paralympic Games, competing in the sport of judo. And emotional expressions of both winning and losing athletes in the gold and bronze medal matches were photographed. So the expressions were spontaneous and they were more likely to be genuine, okay? And then these expressions were coded using the facial action coding system that was developed by Ekman and Friesen. And what this does is the facial action coding system breaks the face down into specific muscular components, and based on whether that component is active or not, the constellation of activation reveals what emotion is being experienced. And so you basically go over the face, identify what muscles are being activated, and you can score the face in terms of what emotion it most closely resembles. Okay. Now, the facial action coding system is used in a lot of different domains. Interestingly, it's used by Pixar, who makes the Toy Story movies. So if you've ever felt like the emotional expressions on those characters are particularly compelling, well, that's because they're tapping into some psychological research that's been done previously. Okay, so here are the results. So what we have here are the correlations, okay, of facial action coding for the different athletes, okay? And so we have the congenitally blind athletes here, right? These are individuals that were blind at birth, okay? And we can see that compared to the non-congenitally blind, right? So individuals that went blind after being born, right? The correlation between their expressions is quite high, right? 0.88, really strong. And the correlation between the expressions of congenitally blind and sighted individuals, right? Really high again, 0.85, right? And this is at match completion, okay? Now receiving their medal, we see even stronger correlations, right? Between congenitally blind athletes, individuals that had no opportunity to learn what social expressions should be made, because they were born blind. But again, we see these strong correlations between congenitally blind athletes' expressions and sighted athletes' expressions. And when on the podium, we see again really strong correlations, 0.9. Okay, so this does suggest that these individuals who were congenitally blind were born blind, had never had the opportunity to learn emotional expressions through social learning. They're making expressions that are very, very similar, right, to sighted athletes, okay? And so despite not having any social learning ability to learn these expressions, they're making very similar expressions. And so this evidence really supports the universal expression hypothesis, right? Despite congenitally blind Olympians not having the opportunity to model facial expressions, they produce expressions highly similar to those of sighted individuals. And these expressions were spontaneously generated, right, in the heat of the competition, increasing the likelihood that these expressions are genuine, right? They're not trying to hold their face in certain ways. These are natural expressions that are being made, okay? So again, this is really strong evidence building on Ekman's work in the early 70s that does suggest that the expression of emotions on the face do have this strong sort of universal component. So we've seen in the past couple of studies that emotional expressions do have this strong universal component, but even Ekman argued that the intensity of these expressions might be moderated by culture, right? And so we still want to explore, despite this evidence suggesting that the expressions people make are universal, we still want to see if there are cultural differences in emotional expressions. And so Tsai and Chentsova-Dutton in 2003 wanted to look at this question, and they start with the idea that many people consider European Americans to be a homogenous group and therefore should be expected to display similar emotional expressions. But others argue that there is significant heterogeneity between European Americans, and that originates in their country of origin. So, for example, in Scandinavian culture, there's an emphasis on emotional control and moderation, and they're more emotionally inhibited than other European cultures, right? So in this European culture, there should be sort of a minimization of emotional expression, right? You don't want to be overly emotional. However, in Irish culture, they're more accepting of expressions of suffering and tragedy, encourage laughter and humor to convey one's feelings, right? So there's no cultural reason to inhibit emotional experience amongst the Irish, right? And so the question is, are we going to see sort of differential patterns in emotional expression based on these different cultures' view of the appropriateness of emotional expression, right? With the Scandinavians being stressing sort of emotional control, and the Irish encouraging sort of emotional expression. So the hypothesis was that if these norms, Scandinavian and Irish norms, are passed on to subsequent generations of Americans, that we should observe differences in emotional expression in European Americans as a function of their cultural heritage. So what they did was they recruited undergraduates from the University of Minnesota, and they had to have one grandparent that was either Scandinavian or Irish with no crossing. So no Irish Scandinavian mixed heritage. And they did a relived emotion test. So participants were asked to describe a time where they experienced happiness, pride, love, anger, and disgust. And so while they were recording or reliving and describing these events, they were being video recorded, and then the videos were coded using the facial action coding system, again, to identify the emotions that were being experienced. So overall, participants of Irish descent displayed more intense facial expressions compared to those of Scandinavian descent, right? So Irish participants expressed 4.4% more happiness, 3.06 more anger, 2.08 more disgust. Okay, and so what this suggests is that while there wasn't sort of significant differences across all emotions, we do see this different pattern, right, where European Americans of Irish descent are making this more intense emotional expressions, at least for some emotions, compared to others. So another way to look at this was to ask the question of, if culture is influencing how individuals are expressing their emotions, then individuals from the same culture should be better at identifying in-group members' emotional expressions, right? So another way to put this would be, if a specific group has specific rules about how emotions should be expressed, the members of the same group should be better than members of the other group at understanding those rules and understanding what emotion the individual is experiencing or how intensely they're experiencing it. Okay, and so Prado wanted to dig into this question, and started with the idea that while facial expressions for basic emotions are universal, there could still be room for small cultural specific changes to these expressions. Okay. And these changes would have to be small enough that the outgroup members would still generally recognize the emotional expression, but they'd have to be large enough that the in-group members would be better than outgroup members at identifying the emotional expression, right? And so we can think about this in terms of cultural display rules, right? These are rules that prescribe how and when facial expression should be modified. And these rules are learned early in life and are expected to vary across cultures, right? So the idea is that culture can influence emotional expression by providing these specific nuances in the ways that emotions are expressed, and that can facilitate sort of more accurate communication within a culture, but confuse outgroup members, right, making it more difficult for them to understand what emotion is being communicated. And so this idea of in-group advantage, again, is the extent to which emotion judgments are more accurate when the perceiver is a member of the same cultural group. And so Prado hypothesized that Anglo-Australians would be more accurately able to recognize and label the emotions expressed by other Anglo-Australians, and individuals of Chinese heritage would more accurately recognize and label emotions expressed by other Chinese individuals. And they also suggested that this effect could be moderated by acculturation, right? So Chinese individuals that had lived for a significant amount of time in Australia, they're going to learn Australian display rules, and that's going to make them better at recognizing Anglo-Australians' emotions. So in this study, they had 51 Anglo-Australians, 51 participants from mainland China, and 51 people of Chinese heritage that were living in Australia. And they basically were given a facial recognition task. And so for Anglo-Australians, they used the Ekman photo database, right? Caucasian individuals making emotional expressions. And for Chinese faces, they used the Nanyang University database. And this is photos of Asians making emotional expressions. So the Nanyang University database is the Asian equivalent of the Ekman photo database. And so participants were just shown a series of photos, both Caucasians and Asian individuals making emotional expressions, and they were just asked to label the emotion that was being displayed. Okay. So here are the results, at least for anger. Okay. So the y-axis here we have the percentage correctly identified. And on the x-axis, we have Chinese faces from the Nanyang database and Caucasian faces from the Ekman database. Okay. And so we can see that Anglo-Australians do show some in-group advantage, right? So for Anglo-Australians here, they're significantly better at identifying the emotions on Caucasian faces compared to the individuals from mainland China. But Chinese individuals living in Australia who had learned display rules, there's no longer an advantage overall. Okay, so for Anglo-Australians, they show an in-group advantage over individuals living in mainland China, but no advantage over individuals of Chinese heritage that were living in Australia. Okay. Now, when we think about Chinese faces, right, for in-group advantage, we would expect individuals from mainland China to be more accurate than the other two groups. But we don't actually see that, right? If anything, we see that Anglo-Australians, again, are better at correctly identifying the emotion expressed on Chinese faces than individuals from mainland China. Okay? And so, at least for the expression anger, we see some evidence for an in-group advantage in recognizing emotions. We see that for the Anglo-Australians for Caucasian faces, but we don't see it for Chinese faces. Okay. And now here's the same results now for the expression fear. And again, we see the same sort of pattern, right? We see that Anglo-Australians are better identifying fear on Caucasian faces than mainland individuals living in mainland China. But again, we don't see an in-group advantage for the Chinese faces, right? Where we'd expect individuals from mainland China to be much better, right, than the Australians at identifying fearful expressions. And last is surprise, emotion is surprise. And again, we see an in-group advantage for Anglo-Australians, this time over both individuals from mainland China and individuals living in Australia of Chinese heritage. But again, we don't see any in-group advantage for Chinese faces for individuals living in mainland China. If anything, again, both Chinese Australians and Anglo-Australians are better at identifying the Chinese faces than individuals from mainland China. So there's some evidence here for this in-group advantage, but it seems to be only in Anglo-Australians and only for certain emotions. So interestingly, mainland Chinese individuals do not show signs of in-group advantage, and we're better at identifying the expressions of Caucasians, right? If we actually go back at the graphs here, if we compare these bars, right, the individuals from mainland China are much better at identifying the Caucasian faces than they are the Chinese faces. And that's true for all of the graphs. And so the question is, well, why? Like, what might explain this this set of results? So one explanation might be that that there simply isn't a universal in-group advantage, right? In-group advantage only happens for some cultural groups, but not others. Another explanation might be that, remember that they use two different databases, right? The Ekman database and the Nanyang database. And there's no mention in the paper of controlling for things like the intensity of the expressions being made. And perhaps the photos from the Nanyang database are less emotionally expressive, right? They're less intense, right? In their emotional expression. And we can see from the Ekman database, these are quite, intense expressions, right? And perhaps that led to more difficulty identifying the emotion. But we can't really know the answer to that question. We're left with basically the idea that there's some evidence for in-group advantage, but not resounding confirmation of this idea. But perhaps we can find evidence of in-group advantage using a different experimental technique. And so Chow and colleagues in 2008 used a brain scan to look at this question. And they noted that the amygdala is a subcortical brain region that is sensitive to evaluating and responding to cue signaling fear, right? Or threat. Fear being the response to threat. And prior research had shown that exposure to faces showing a fear expression elicit increased amygdala activity. Okay, so the idea is if you're exposed to a face showing a fear response, there must be some threat in the environment, right? And that activates your amygdala, which is involved in experiencing fear. So they noted that, however, there's no cross-cultural testing of this effect. And so if there's an in-group advantage, right, if the in-group advantage hypothesis is correct, then amygdala response could be greater for one's own cultural fear expressions compared to other cultural fear expressions. Okay? So they're taking the same sort of idea that Prado and colleagues wanted to look at, but they're using a different measure here, right, in terms of neural activation. So they had 10 Caucasians living in the U.S. and 10 Japanese individuals living in Japan. And this was the procedure. So they would basically just see a series of faces, right? So here's, for the Japanese group, here's a fear expression from one's own culture, and here's some different emotional expressions, and here's another, a fear expression from a different culture. And for the Caucasian group, they just reverse this pattern. Okay, so they're seeing a whole bunch of different emotional expressions from in-group and out-group members, but we're looking only at the responses to the fearful faces. And participants completed 360 trials divided into 4 blocks, and the photos were presented for 1.5 seconds, and the participants identified the emotional expression in the photo, right, with a button press. Okay, so here are the results. Okay. So, interestingly, participants were accurate at identifying both own and other cultural expressions, okay? So in terms of simply identifying, right, what emotional expression was being presented to them, there was little evidence of the in-group advantage, right, at this behavioral level, right? So when they're just asked to identify the emotion, they're not doing any better or worse identifying emotional expressions from their own culture versus from a different culture. But at the neural level, right, amygdala activity was much stronger for one's own culture fear expressions compared to other culture fear expressions. So if we look here, here's the left amygdala response. We can see that for happy, angry, and neutral photos, there's actually no difference between one's own culture and other culture in terms of amygdala activity. But for fear, right, we see this big increase in activity for one's own cultural fear expressions than for another cultural fear expressions. And we see this as well in the right amygdala, same pattern of results. Okay. And so here on this different level of analysis, right, we have the behavioral level where we're just identifying the emotions, but now we have this neural level of analysis. Here we are seeing substantial in-group advantage, right? There's differential processing happening for fearful expressions from one's own culture compared to the culture, another person's culture. Now, what about the effect of context, right? How might context affect the perception of emotion, right? And we already saw a glimpse of this in the first slide that I showed, right? We first saw just the zoomed in face, the expression, just the head with an emotional expression, and then zoom out to see the individual is actually winning an Olympic medal. And we can see how context can change our perceptions of what an individual is experiencing. But Masuda and colleagues wanted to apply a cross-cultural lens to this and noted that East Asians, right, individuals that have a more interdependent construal, show greater concern for social relationships and accommodation to others compared to North Americans, right, who have a more independent construal. And so emotional expressions reflect the state of interpersonal relationships, and an individual's feelings are inseparable from the feelings of the larger group, right? So for an interdependent individual, one's emotions are a function of their the state of the relationships they're in and how other people in their group feel. Right? Now, North Americans show greater concern for the individual and self-expression as compared to East Asians. Right? Emotional expressions are really about a person's inner feelings. Okay. And so Masuda and colleagues hypothesized that when we're inferring the emotions of a target, that Japanese participants, right, more interdependent individuals, will be more sensitive to social context than Westerners in terms of identifying the emotion. And so participants were 39 American students and 36 Japanese students. And so what they did was the participants were told that the study was to determine whether facial animations were significantly clear to be used in a children's educational program. And they were asked to rate the emotions of the middle person in the scene. Okay, so they were asked to rate the emotion of the middle person in the scene, right? So this guy here or this individual here, and they indicate that a person's degree of anger, sadness, joy using a 10-point scale. And they varied these central figures on whether they were Asian or Caucasian, the intensity of the emotion, whether it was moderate or intense, and the type of emotional expression. So anger, sadness, happiness, or neutral. But what was interesting is how they varied the context, right? So the background figures, right, these people back here, right, they varied the type of emotion that the people were experiencing. So anger, sadness, happiness, or neutral. And the intensity was always moderate. Okay. But what's interesting when we think about the central versus the background figure is that now we have trials where the emotional expressions between the individual in the foreground and the individual in the background are congruent, right? They match, right? Everybody is expressing happiness, or everybody is expressing sadness, etc. Or we have contexts where the individual in the foreground is happy, but everybody else is sad. Right, like in this picture here. So this guy looks happy, but everybody else is sad in the background. And this guy is kind of looking angry, but everybody else is happy. Right. So we have these situations where the context either matches the individual in the foreground or mismatches. Okay. And so how is that going to impact the ratings of the emotion that this person is thought to be experiencing? Okay. Okay, so when the backgrounds match, right, foreground and backgrounds match, so the individual is experiencing anger and the individuals in the context are also angry, right? We don't see any differences between Japanese and Americans, right? They're rating the emotions of that central figure as being equal, okay? So when there's no incongruity between the emotional expression of the person in the foreground and the people in the background, right? There's no difference in the emotional ratings of Japanese and American participants. However, when the foreground and background mismatch, now we do start to see changes in ratings, okay? So we can see that when there's a mismatch between the emotions of the foreground and background characters, Japanese emotion ratings were lower than Americans, right? And this suggests that Japanese participants were more strongly impacted by the context than American participants, okay? So what we have here, anger is the emotion that the central figure is expressing, right? And is the actual emotion that people are rating, participants are rating. And the second emotion listed here is what the context is, what the figures in the context are feeling, right? So in this case, happiness, right? And so when asked to rate how angry, right, this individual is, right, for Americans, it's about a 7.5, right? But for Japanese individuals, right, they're taking into account the happiness context. And so their ratings of anger are a bit lower, right? When the individual was expressing sadness, but the rest of the members of the group were experiencing happiness, right? American sadness ratings were higher than Japanese participants. And the same when the individual was expressing happiness, but everybody else was experiencing anger, right? Happiness ratings were significantly lower for the Japanese participant. Okay? And so what this suggests is that when there's this background mismatch, right, the Japanese individuals are taking account of this contextual information, and they're using it to, and it's changing how they're thinking about the emotional experience of the individual that they're actually asked to rate. Okay, and so this suggests that in the context of how culture might influence our perceptions of emotion, is that more interdependent individuals are going to be taking context information much more strongly into account when thinking about how an individual is feeling than more independently construed individuals. But remember that quote from the beginning from James that said, what would joy, rage, love be without the heart palpitations, muscle tensions, etc.? So what we've seen so far is that there does seem to be evidence of this, universal expression of emotions, right, in terms of the work by Ekman and colleagues. But there is room for this cultural influence, right, of how how emotions are expressed, right, their intensity, etc. But do we see any differentiation at the deeper level, at the physiological level, right? That idea of heart palpitations, muscle tension. Do we see differences in autonomic nervous system activation between cultures? And there's actually not very much work on this, but there is a paper by Tsai and Levinson in 1997, and they were asking the question of, do cultural beliefs and values regarding emotional expression translate into actual physiological differences, right? And differences in the physiological response. And so what they did is they had 22 Chinese American heterosexual couples and 20 European American heterosexual couples. And the couples came to the lab and they were attached to a whole range of physiological sensors. And there was this baseline period where the participants spent about 5 minutes in silence. And then they engaged in a 15-minute conversation about the events of the day. Okay, so this is just to get a baseline of their a baseline physiology measure. And then the key part was that they had the couples engage in a conflict conversation. Okay, so with the experimenter, the couples identified strongest areas of conflict in their relationship, so things like jealousy or communication. And then they spent 15 minutes attempting to resolve this conflict, right? So again, this is going to be like a fairly emotionally charged situation. We would expect physiological arousal to be heightened, when dealing with, a strong conflict within the context of a relationship. Okay. So here are the results. So consistent with the idea that Chinese Americans endorse sort of emotional moderation, right? Self-reports of their emotional experience showed less variability, and they reported shorter periods of positive affect. Okay, so we can see this in the results here. So here's Chinese Americans and here's European Americans, and we can see here that they reported less variability than European Americans, right? So less emotional highs and lows, right? And they also reported fewer periods of positive affect, right? Experiencing positive emotions, right? Than European Americans. Okay, and so at the level of their how they're appraising, right, their emotional experience, we can see that there are differences between Chinese Americans and European Americans, right? Now the question is there any evidence to suggest that the differences here correspond to actual physiological differences between the two groups? Okay. And so here are the results, the physiological results. Now, I don't want you to be too worried about what each of these different physiological measures are, right? If you want to learn more, you can see what these acronyms correspond to. But the idea is that these are just all measures of sort of physiological arousal, okay? And what we see is that there's only two measures, right, where we see any difference between groups, right? Where on the SCL, right, we have Chinese Americans higher than European Americans, and on the IBI, we have European Americans higher than Chinese Americans, okay? But so those cancel out, right? All of these higher numbers mean more arousal, right? And on 2 to 3, we see significant differences, but one indicates higher arousal on part of the Chinese Americans, and the other indicates higher arousal on the part of the European Americans, and the rest, there's no physiological differences. Okay. And so despite self-reported differences in their emotional experience, right, there was no effect of culture on overall physiological arousal, right? And therefore, at the physiological level, there's no difference in emotional response. Okay. And so what this suggests is that Ekman, there's evidence to support Ekman's view that, emotions are this sort of evolutionary product, right, that produce these different physiological responses, right? And that's universal across culture, right? But at the same time, how that physiological response is interpreted, right, by the individuals that are experiencing them, that's going to vary across culture, right? And that's what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing differences in the perceptions of their emotional experience during this experiment, right? But we're not seeing any differences in their actual physiology, right? Everybody's experiencing the same type of physiological response, but it's being interpreted in different ways. Okay. So we do have evidence to support the idea that emotions do represent, there is evidence to suggest that emotions are universal in some sense, right? And that they've been derived through our evolutionary history because they're adaptive. They provide us with an advantage. Now, we want to go on to a second question is, well, how do we experience emotions, right? And are there cultural differences in how we experience different emotions? And that's going to be the topic of the next few slides. Okay, so if we go back to the lecture where we were discussing independent and interdependent self-construal, we remember this table 1 from Marcus and Kitayama 91, and it really laid out the difference between interdependent self-construal, especially in the tasks that the different types of construals tend to engage in, with independent individuals striving to be more unique and expressing themselves, realizing internal goals, promoting their own goals, being direct, etc., and more interdependent individuals wanting to fit in, trying to occupy one's proper place, engage in appropriate action, promote others' goals, be indirect, etc. And so when we think about the differences between independent, interdependent self-construal and how those differences, different conceptions of self impact how individuals operate in the world, we wouldn't be off base to think that whether one is more interdependent or independent is going to have an influence on their emotional experience. So Mosqueda and Kurosawa in 2002 wanted to look at differences in emotional experience across cultures. And they start with the idea that emotions are contingent on the concerns we have. And for the researchers here, concerns are a desire for the occurrence or the non-occurrence of an event in a given situation, right? Desired events lead to positive emotions, while negative events lead to negative emotions, okay? And so when we think about what these concerns might be, well, they're going to vary across cultures because different cultures are going to place differential emphases on different aspects of life, okay? And so Mosqueda and Kurosawa hypothesized that Americans would evaluate emotional events as more pleasant compared to Japanese participants due to the American tendency to strive for a more positive sense of self and more positive outcomes. Okay, so this is just drawn straight from sort of differences between more interdependent individuals, i.e. Japanese participants here, and more independently construed individuals and American participants. So in this study, there were 53 American college students and 46 Japanese college students, and they underwent what's known as a experience sampling procedure. And so participants completed an emotion questionnaire 4 times a day. And the participants were asked if they had experienced any emotion in the past 3 hours. And they were asked to rate the pleasantness of the emotion and describe what had happened. Okay. And they also filled out this concerns questionnaire regarding the event that had happened and whether it had these different concerns. So were they more independent concerns that had taken place during this event? Things like with themes like self-control or personal success or ability to cope? Or did the events have more interdependent concerns like social distance, loss of face, bad relationship, etc.? So here are the results. On the y-axis here we have pleasantness ratings and Japanese and American participants on the x-axis. And so as hypothesized, Americans participants tended to rate their emotional experiences as more positive compared to Japanese participants overall. And here we have a second graph. So on the y-axis here we have how well different concerns, right? Those more, let's go back here, independent concerns versus interdependent concerns predicted pleasantness ratings, right? So if an event contained more independent or interdependent concerns, were there more pleasant emotions being experienced, okay? And so for American participants, all right, whether they were experiencing more independent or interdependent concerns, it really didn't impact the pleasantness ratings for that experience, right? But for Japanese participants who are more interdependent, okay, when they were experiencing an interdependent concern, that's when pleasantness ratings were significantly higher, right, overall. And so for Japanese participants, these interdependent concerns really predicted an increase in pleasantness ratings. And so we can see that, first of all, more interdependent individuals are experiencing less positive emotion overall. And when they are experiencing pleasant emotion, it's tied to very specific types of concerns, that being they're more likely to experience pleasant emotions if the events they had been experiencing concerned more interdependent themes. Okay, and so we can see how self-construal has impacted the emotional experience of these individuals. Now, Kitayama and colleagues in 2006 wanted to also look at differences in emotional experience, and they start with the idea that the types of emotions an individual experience reflect reactions to relational themes, right? So similar to Mosqueda in 2002, this idea of the emotions are going to be a reflection of the concerns that we're dealing with. Here, Kitayama is talking about our emotions are going to reflect what relations are at play in a given situation. And culture provides information about what relations should be attended to most and what an appropriate emotional response should be in a specific context, right? So depending on who you're interacting with, that's going to inform what kind of emotional responses are appropriate. And as cultures vary systematically on a number of different dimensions, it's likely that these differences will be reflected in differences in the types of and the intensity of the emotions people experience. Okay. So, according to Kitayama and colleagues, for an individual with a more interdependent construal who's going to be more focused on social harmony, these socially engaging emotions, or emotions associated with social interdependence and are relationally embedded, right? They're going to be more close to the surface, right? So feelings like friendly feelings, close feelings, respect, sympathy, right? These are positive, more socially engaging emotions that are going to be linked to more interdependent self-construal. And negative emotions like guilt, indebtedness, and shame, right? Again, these emotions are tied to different relational themes that are the person's going to be encountering, okay? But for independent individuals, they're going to be focused more on personal goals, achievements, and personal achievements. And so socially disengaging emotions, which are more associated with autonomy of the self and separateness from others, are going to be felt more strongly by individuals with a more independent self-construal. And so on the positive side, feelings like pride and superiority and self-esteem, but on the negative side, things like frustration and anger. So Kitayama and colleagues' hypothesis was that individuals with a greater interdependent self-construal are going to report experiencing more socially engaging emotions, while individuals with a greater independent self-construal are going to report experiencing more socially disengaging emotions. Okay, and so they had 38 Japanese college students and 49 American college students, and they underwent a daily diary study, so similar to experience sampling, where participants were asked to remember and describe the most emotional episode of the day for 14 consecutive days. Okay, so unlike the experience sampling study where individuals were asked to complete questionnaires 4 times a day, here you're just asked to recall the most emotional episode you experienced that day for a 14-day period. And they were also asked to report how intensely they experienced each of these 27 different emotions. Okay, and 15 emotions make up the socially engaging, disengaging scale. And so this just gives you summation of what constitutes positive engaging emotions, positive disengaging emotions, negative engaging emotions, and negative disengaging emotions. Okay, and so the idea is that disengaging emotions are going to be more likely to be experienced by more independently construed individuals, and the engaging emotions are going to be experienced more by more interdependently construed people. Okay, so here are the results. And on the y-axis here, we have the intensity of the emotional experience. Okay? And what we can see here is that we have it broken down here by positive situations and negative situations. Okay? And so when we're thinking about positive emotions, right? During positive situations, the amount of positive engaging emotions, there's no difference between Japanese and American participants in the intensity of experience. Okay, so when they're engaged in a positive situation, the amount of these positive engaging emotions, there's no difference in the intensity that participants are experiencing those emotions, right? Regardless of whether they're Japanese or American. But these positive disengaging emotions, right, the ones associated more with an independent self-construal, we can see that Americans, right, are experiencing significantly more intensity of these disengaging emotions in positive situations, right? So things like pride and esteem, okay? Now, we're not going to worry too much about the negative engaging and disengaging emotions here, but you can really see there's really no difference in emotional experience here between Americans and Japanese participants. On thinking about negative situations, okay, so we're experiencing some negative situation, what kind of positive emotions are we experiencing, okay? And we can see that for Americans, right, they're, experiencing the same amount of engaging and disengaging emotions. Japanese individuals are experiencing the same amount of engaging and disengaging emotions, but Japanese individuals are experiencing more emotion overall, right? both disengaging emotions and engaging emotions. So in these negative situations, right, it seems that Japanese individuals are experiencing more emotionality overall, right, both engaging and disengaging types of emotions. Now, again, we're in a negative situation, but we're thinking about these negative emotions, right? For negative engaging emotions, Japanese individuals are experiencing more of these negative engaging emotions than Americans, right? And it flips on the other side, right? So Americans are experiencing more of these disengaging emotions than Japanese individuals, okay? And so we see, right, this differential pattern, right, between Americans and Japanese individuals based on the type of situation they're in, right, whether it be a positive or negative situation, and as well as the type of emotions they're experiencing in these situations, right, with generally a general trend for Americans experiencing more disengaging emotions, whether they're negative or positive, and Japanese individuals experiencing more engaging emotions overall. And key here is that what we have here is whether the amount of engaging emotion or disengaging emotion that individuals reported, how well that predicts a general positive happiness score, right? So how much does feeling these different emotions predict the individual's rating of happiness for that day? And we can see that for Japanese participants, right, experiencing more engaging emotions is positively correlated with happiness, right? And it's also positively correlated with these disengaging emotions, but the experiencing engaging emotions, the relationship between engaging emotions and happiness is much stronger than the relationship between disengaging emotions and happiness. And we can see for American participants, right, the flip, right? So there's a stronger relationship between experiencing disengaging emotions and happiness than engaging emotions and happiness, okay? And so this really suggests that for individuals, when we're thinking about overall well-being or just a general sense of happiness, it seems like Japanese, more interdependently construed individuals experience the most happiness when they're experiencing engaging emotions. And the Americans, these more independently construed individuals, they're experiencing more happiness when they're experiencing disengaging emotions. So these two studies, Mosqueda and colleagues and Kitayama and colleagues, do highlight this idea of differential emotional experience. And this stems from the idea that depending on how an individual construes the self, either independent or interdependent, that's going to alter the goals and ideals that they're striving for, and that's going to alter what types of emotional experiences are valued and which ones are not valued, and also sort of what rules about what emotions should be displayed and which ones should not. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I just wanted to try to summarize what we've been talking about in sort of one larger model. And so there's this biocultural model of emotion by Levinson and colleagues. And we'll just walk through this model step by step, okay? So we have an outside an event, right, or a stimulus that's coming into the system, okay? And first we have some kind of appraisal, right, about what's going on in this event, okay? And now this box represents sort of inside the mind, right? We've had this appraisal, and now we're scanning our internal memory for some information to match a prototype, right? Do we have some kind of set action pattern to deal with an event and this appraisal, okay? And once we do, we activate some facial expression that's going to be tied to some subjective experience, and it's also going to be tied to some amount of autonomic arousal, okay? And now we're coming outside the box, so now we're talking about how we're thinking about or how we're going to display this emotional reaction that we're experiencing. And you can see that these arrows are different colors, Okay. And so what this suggests is, what the white arrow is suggesting here is that in terms of controlling our autonomic response, there's very little that culture is doing, right, to modify that physiological response. So you might see somebody, sweating or tremoring or smiling, right? There's this automatic emotional response that's not going to be affected by differential cultural upbringing. This facial expression arrow is a little bit lighter, right, which is suggesting that there is some evolutionary determined facial action patterns that are going to be engaged in, but there is some room for cultural influence in terms of how intense those emotional expressions are. And then we have the sort of subjective experience of that emotion, right? And that's the darkest arrow here, right? And that's really culturally sort of derived, right? We can think about how we think about these experiences in a broader context, a broader cultural context, and how we think about those events is going to be highly influenced by the culture that we're raised in. Okay. And so, just to summarize what we've talked about today, going on this sort of theme that we can think about how culture impacts how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves, and we can also think about how it's going to affect our emotions. And so we have seen that emotions do seem to have this universal component, right? That we can sort of identify 6 major emotions that are recognizable across cultures, but there's also room for modification based on culture, and that modification it usually comes in the form of how and when and how intensely an emotion is displayed. All right, so that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. We'll be back next week, and we'll be talking about how culture influences different motivations. So have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.